This happened on a late December night in 2018. I was driving back to my hometown in Pennsylvania after visiting some friends in Chicago for the holidays. It was supposed to be a relaxing road trip, just me, my car, and my dog Max, a German Shepherd I'd had since college. But as the night dragged on, the trip turned into something I'll never forget. The day had been fine, but I'd left Chicago later than planned, so I ended up driving through the middle of nowhere as the sun dipped below the horizon. The roads were empty save for the occasional truck rumbling past. Snow had started to fall lightly, and the temperature was brutal. My plan was to make it home by midnight, but with every passing hour, that goal felt more impossible. Max was in the back seat, lying down but alert. He always got a little restless during long drives, so I wasn't surprised when he stood up and started whining around 9 p.m. I figured he needed a bathroom break, so I kept an eye out for a good place to pull over. About 10 minutes later, I spotted a small dirt turnout leading to what looked like an old hiking trail. It wasn't ideal, but it would do. I parked the car and stepped out into the freezing night. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I leashed Max and led him toward the edge of the trail. The air was painfully cold, and the forest surrounding us was eerily silent. I let Max sniff around, trying to hurry him along so we could get back on the road. That's when I heard it, a sound coming from deeper in the woods. It wasn't the rustling of leaves or the snap of a twig. Those sounds wouldn't have alarmed me. This was different. It was rhythmic, footsteps. Max froze, his ears perked up. He growled low in his throat, something he rarely did. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped entirely. I scanned the darkness, my breath fogging up in the frigid air. I couldn't see anything beyond the faint glow of the car's headlights. "Come on, Max, let's go," I whispered, tugging on his leash. But Max didn't move. He just kept growling, staring into the black void of the forest. And then, suddenly, he barked, loud, sharp, and aggressive. It startled me so much that I almost dropped the leash. That's when I saw it, a figure. It was standing maybe 20 feet away, just beyond the edge of the light. I could barely make it out, but it was tall, too tall to be anything normal. It was unnaturally thin, its limbs long and distorted. The way it stood, slightly hunched like it was watching me, made my skin crawl. I yanked on Max's leash, desperate to get back to the car, but before I could take another step, the figure moved. It didn't walk or run. It lunged forward, closing the distance between us in an instant. Max barked furiously, his hackles raised, but I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and sprinted back to the car, dragging Max behind me. The snow made it harder to run, and I could hear the sound of something chasing us. I reached the car and flung the door open, shoving Max inside before scrambling in after him. I locked the doors and fumbled for the keys, my hands shaking so badly that I almost dropped them. When I finally started the engine, the headlights illuminated the forest ahead. There were 3 figures now. All of them were standing at the edge of the woods, their heads tilted unnaturally, their hollow eyes locked on me. I didn't wait to find out what they wanted. I floored it, the tires spinning in the snow before catching traction and propelling us forward. My heart was pounding hard. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those things chasing us down the road, but they didn't. The rest of the drive was a blur. Max was trembling in the back seat, and I kept glancing at him, worried he might be hurt. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a moment, trying to calm down. I didn't tell anyone what happened that night. I knew they wouldn't believe me. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those footsteps in my dreams. And I always wake up wondering if they ever left the woods. This happened a couple of years ago on New Year's Eve, and I still get chills every time I think about it. I was visiting my sister who lived in a small mountain town in Vermont. I hadn't seen her in months, so we planned to ring in the new year together. I decided to drive up from Boston after work that day, thinking I'd make it in plenty of time. The drive started off normal. The sun was already setting when I hit the highway, but I didn't mind driving at night. I've always found it peaceful. After about an hour, the GPS rerouted me off the main road because of an accident. Instead, it directed me down some rural back roads. I didn't think much of it at first. It was Vermont, after all. Winding roads and dense woods were pretty standard. About halfway into the detour, I noticed something odd. There were no other cars on the road. Not one. It was New Year's Eve, and I figured at least a few people would be out and about, but I seemed to be the only one driving through this stretch of forest. Then the snow started. At first it was light, just soft flakes dancing in my headlights. But it quickly picked up. Within minutes, it became a full-blown storm. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and my little car wasn't handling the slick roads very well. I started feeling nervous, gripping the wheel tighter as the tires slipped a little on the curves. The GPS chimed in again, telling me to turn onto an even smaller, narrower road. I hesitated. It looked barely wide enough for one car, but I didn't see any better options. Reluctantly, I turned, creeping forward at a snail's pace. That's when I saw it. In the middle of the road, there was a figure standing still. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or even a moose. But as I got closer, I realized it was a person. They were wearing a long coat and what looked like a wide-brimmed hat. Their back was to me, and they weren't moving at all, just standing there in the snowstorm. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. I honked lightly, hoping they'd step aside. They didn't. I rolled down my window a crack, letting in the freezing air, and called out, "Hey, are you okay?" No response. The figure didn't even flinch. My heart started pounding. I didn't want to get out of the car, but I couldn't just sit there either. I inched the car forward, hoping the headlights would make them move. Finally, they turned around. The person's face was obscured by shadows, but something was wrong. Their head was tilted at an odd angle, and their shoulders seemed unnaturally hunched. They just stood there staring at my car. I put the car in reverse, ready to back up, but as soon as I moved, they started walking toward me, slowly, deliberately. Panic set in. The road was too narrow to turn around, and the snowstorm had made reversing a dangerous gamble. I couldn't see where I'd come from, and the idea of backing into a ditch terrified me. The figure kept coming closer. I floored it. The car jolted forward, and I swerved around them, barely missing their outstretched hand. My heart was racing as I glanced in the rearview mirror. They were standing in the middle of the road, watching me. I didn't slow down again. I just kept driving, white-knuckling the wheel as the storm raged on. The GPS recalculated, directing me toward what it said was a main road. I kept hoping I'd see some other cars, a house, anything, but the road was completely empty. Then, to my horror, I saw headlights behind me. They were distant at first, just a faint glow in the storm, but they were gaining fast. My stomach twisted. There was no way anyone else would be out here in this weather. It had to be them. The headlights closed the distance alarmingly quickly. Within moments, they were right behind me, high beams flooding my car. I couldn't see a thing. I tried to speed up, but my car wasn't built for this. It skidded on the ice, nearly spinning out. The vehicle behind me honked, an angry, blaring sound that seemed to echo endlessly through the storm. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, the headlights were gone. I glanced in the rearview mirror. There was nothing, just an empty, snow-covered road stretching into darkness. I didn't stop driving until I reached my sister's house. By the time I got there, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely unbuckle my seatbelt. I tried to tell my sister what happened, but I couldn't make sense of it myself. She chalked it up to exhaustion and bad weather, but I knew what I saw. To this day, I don't know who, or what, was standing in that road or driving behind me. But every New Year's Eve, I think about it, and I wonder if they're still out there, waiting for the next unlucky driver. I've always liked taking late-night drives. There's something about the solitude, the hum of the engine, and the empty roads that feels calming. This happened a few years ago, during the holidays. I was visiting my parents in rural Minnesota. They live in a small, quiet town surrounded by dense forests and endless farmland. It was Christmas Eve, and after spending most of the day with family, I decided to go for a drive. The roads were icy and the sky was dark, but I figured it wouldn't be a problem. I'd stick to the main roads and take it slow. I ended up driving farther than I planned. The town's streetlights faded into the rearview mirror, and soon I was on a 2-lane road flanked by trees. Snow had started falling. Light at first, but it quickly picked up. I told myself I'd turn back after the next bend, but then I noticed something ahead. A car parked on the side of the road, hazard lights flashing. I slowed down and pulled over, rolling down my window. The car looked like it had slid into a ditch, the front end buried in snow. A man stood beside it, waving his arms. He was wearing a heavy coat and a beanie, but I could see his face clearly in my headlights. Mid-30s, unshaven with a panicked look. "Thank you," stopped, rushing toward me. "I need help, my car's stuck, and my wife's just down the road. She needs a doctor." His voice cracked, and he sounded genuinely distressed. I hesitated, glancing at my phone. No service. I could have just driven off, but what kind of person would I be if I didn't help? I nodded and unlocked the passenger door. Hop in. I'll take you there." He climbed in quickly, brushing snow off his coat. "It's not far," he said, pointing down the road. I turned the car around and started driving. The snow was coming down harder now, and the windshield wipers barely kept up. The man sat quietly, gripping his knees. After a few minutes, I noticed something odd. He wasn't giving me directions anymore. I glanced over at him. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched. "Where exactly is your wife?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. After a moment, he muttered, "Just keep driving." My grip on the steering wheel tightened. Something about his tone sent a chill through me. The road ahead was narrowing, the trees closing in on both sides. I slowed down. "You sure we're going the right way?" He finally looked at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You'll see it soon." That was it. My gut was screaming at me to stop. I pulled over, pretending to adjust the rearview mirror. "I think my tire's low," I said. "I need to check it." He didn't respond, just watched as I unbuckled my seatbelt. The moment I stepped out, I slammed the door shut and bolted into the woods. The cold air burned my lungs as I ran. I didn't dare look back. Branches clawed at my jacket and the snow muffled my footsteps. I ducked behind a tree, trying to catch my breath. That's when I heard it. Footsteps crunching in the snow. "Hey, where'd you go?" His voice was closer than I expected. I pressed myself against the tree, my heart pounding. "I just need your help," he called, his tone sharper now. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. After a few minutes, the footsteps faded. I waited until I couldn't hear him anymore before making my way back to the road. When I got there, my car was gone. I ended up walking for what felt like hours before I saw headlights in the distance. It was a police car. The officer rolled down his window, and I quickly explained what had happened. They found my car abandoned a few miles away, but the man was never caught. To this day, I wonder what his real plan was, and how close I came to finding out. This happened just last month, and I still get chills thinking about it. I'm 22 and recently moved into a small rental house just outside the city. It's a modest place, but it's my first time living on my own, so I was excited about having some space to myself. The house is on a quiet street with only a few neighbors nearby, and there's a small wooded area behind the backyard. The first couple of nights went by without incident, but on my third night, something strange happened. It was late, maybe around 11:30 p.m., and I was sitting on the couch scrolling through my phone while a show played on the TV. Out of nowhere, I heard a faint tapping noise coming from the back door. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe a tree branch brushing against the house. I ignored it, but the tapping continued, steady and deliberate. Curious, but slightly on edge, I got up and peeked through the blinds. The backyard was dark, and I couldn't see much beyond the faint glow of the porch light. I opened the door a crack and looked out, but there was nothing there. Shrugging it off, I locked the door and went back to the couch, trying to convince myself I was just hearing things. About half an hour later, just as I was about to head to bed, the tapping started again. This time it was louder, and it wasn't coming from the back door. It was coming from the window near the kitchen. I froze. The blinds were closed, but I could feel someone, or something, on the other side. I mustered up the courage to lift a corner of the blinds, and that's when I saw him. A man was standing outside, pressed up against the glass. His face was pale, and his eyes looked empty, unfocused. He wasn't moving, just staring into the house. My heart started racing. I stepped back, trying to stay quiet. I didn't know if he had seen me, but I wasn't about to find out. I grabbed my phone and called the police, whispering into the receiver as I explained what was happening. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line and remain somewhere safe. I locked myself in the bathroom, clutching the phone tightly. From there, I could hear faint noises, scratching like someone was running their nails along the siding of the house. Minutes felt like hours. Then, just as I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway, the noises stopped. When the officers arrived, they searched the property but didn't find anyone. They told me it was likely some drifter or a prankster, but they promised to patrol the area more often. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. A muddy footprint on the porch, right in front of the back door. It wasn't just a random prank. Someone had been there, watching, waiting. Nothing like that has happened again since, but I double-check every lock now before going to bed. I can't stop wondering what would have happened if I hadn't locked the doors, or if the police hadn't shown up when they did. When I was around 12 years old, my family moved to a small town surrounded by dense woods. Our house sat on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, with the backyard leading into a vast forest. My younger brother and I often played back there, exploring trails and climbing trees until the sun started to set. One Saturday evening, just before dusk, my brother and I decided to check out a part of the forest we hadn't explored yet. We grabbed our flashlights, knowing it would get dark soon, and headed into the woods. This section felt different, quieter, with fewer trails and thicker underbrush. The trees seemed closer together, their twisted branches forming eerie shapes in the fading light. After about 20 minutes of walking, we found a small clearing with a weathered wooden bench sitting in the middle. It looked old, almost out of place, like it had been abandoned there decades ago. We sat down talking and laughing, not paying attention to how quickly the light was disappearing. When we finally noticed how dark it had gotten, I felt a strange unease settle over me. The usual sounds of the forest, birds, insects, were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence. My brother and I decided it was time to head back. As we walked, the beam of my flashlight bounced off the trees, casting long, jagged shadows. We were maybe halfway home when we both stopped in our tracks. Ahead of us, just beyond the edge of the light, we heard something. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching through the leaves. We froze, scanning the darkness with our flashlights, but we couldn't see anything. Probably just a deer, I whispered, trying to convince myself as much as him. But the footsteps didn't move away. They circled around us, stopping just out of sight. My brother gripped my arm, his face pale. "We need to go," he muttered. I nodded, and we picked up the pace, trying to stay calm. The footsteps followed us, keeping the same slow, deliberate rhythm. Then they stopped. We turned around, shining our flashlights back the way we came. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from the darkness, we saw it. Two faint, glowing eyes staring at us from between the trees. I didn't wait to see more. "Run," I shouted, grabbing my brother's hand and bolting through the forest. The trees seemed to close in around us as we stumbled over roots and bushes, the flashlight beam jerking wildly. Behind us, the sound of heavy footsteps grew louder, faster, crashing through the underbrush. I could hear my brother panting as he struggled to keep up, but I didn't dare look back. My only focus was getting out of the woods. Finally, I saw the faint glow of the backyard lights through the trees. We burst into the yard, slamming the gate shut behind us. I turned around, breathing hard, expecting to see something. But the forest was silent again, the darkness impenetrable. My parents ran out to ask what had happened, and we tried to explain, but I'm not sure they believed us. They chalked it up to an animal or our imaginations. But my brother and I knew better. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me, and I went back to the clearing. The bench was still there, but the ground around it was disturbed. Deep, heavy footprints leading in circles before disappearing into the woods. I don't know what followed us that night, and I don't want to know. But even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't just an animal. It was a Friday night, and my roommate and I decided to hit up a small cafe in town that was hosting an open mic night. We didn't go out often, so it felt like a nice change of pace. I grabbed my jacket, wallet, and phone before we left the apartment. The cafe was packed when we got there, but we managed to find a small table near the back. The performances were fun, and we lost track of time as we laughed and talked. At some point, I reached for my phone to check the time, but it wasn't in my pocket. I figured I might have left it in the car, so I borrowed my roommate's phone to call it. The call connected after one ring. "Hello?" I said, my voice slightly confused. There was no response, just the faint sound of static and breathing. My heart sank. I repeated, "Hello," but the line went dead. I handed the phone back to my roommate, trying to shake off the weird feeling. "Probably a glitch," I said, though I didn't entirely believe it. After a couple more performances, we decided to call it a night. We got back to the car and looked everywhere, but my phone wasn't there. That's when I remembered. I'd left it on my nightstand at home. The thought hit me like a brick. Someone had answered my phone. I drove back to our apartment in tense silence. My roommate joked that I was probably just overthinking it, but I could tell they were unnerved too. When we got home, the apartment was eerily quiet. I cautiously walked to my room and flipped on the light. My phone was sitting there on the nightstand, exactly where I'd left it. I grabbed it and checked the call log. The outgoing call to my phone was there, but no record of anyone answering. My stomach churned as I noticed something else. A photo in my gallery that I hadn't taken. It was dark and blurry, but I could make out the outline of my bed, and in the foreground, the silhouette of someone standing in the doorway. I locked the phone and put it down, my hands shaking. My roommate suggested calling the police, but when we checked the apartment, there were no signs of forced entry. No evidence that anyone had been there. I barely slept that night, constantly checking the locks and jumping at every creak and sound. Nothing else happened after that, but to this day, I can't explain how someone answered my phone or how that photo ended up on it. This happened during my last summer before starting college. I had a part-time job at a small, family-run grocery store in our quiet little town. It wasn't anything glamorous, but it gave me some spending money, and I didn't mind the work. My shifts were usually in the afternoon, but one evening my manager asked if I could stay late and close up. He had a family emergency, and I agreed. I figured a few extra hours wouldn't hurt. By 9:30 p.m., the store was empty, and I started the usual closing routine, sweeping the aisles, restocking the shelves, and locking the doors. I wasn't nervous about being there alone. It was a small town, and nothing ever happened. I locked the front doors at 10 o'clock sharp, flipped the open sign to closed, and went to the back office to count the register and finish up. While I was sitting at the desk, I heard a faint noise, a soft thud, like something had fallen. It wasn't unusual for things to shift on the shelves, so I ignored it. But a few seconds later, I heard it again, this time closer. It sounded like it came from one of the aisles. I froze, staring at the office door. I knew for a fact I had locked the front doors. Maybe someone had stayed inside after closing, hidden in one of the aisles. My heart started to race. Grabbing my phone, I quietly dialed the store's landline number to see if the phone at the register would ring. If it didn't, I'd know someone had unplugged it. When the line connected, I heard the phone out front start to ring. I let out a shaky breath. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I hung up and went back to the register to grab my bag, eager to get out of there. As I walked into the front of the store, I glanced down the aisles, and that's when I noticed something strange. One of the lights near the back was flickering. Nothing too unusual, but what caught my attention was the shadow. There was a shadow on the floor that didn't match any of the shelves or displays. It looked like the outline of a person, standing perfectly still. I felt my stomach drop. I slowly backed up toward the front doors, fumbling in my pocket for the keys. My plan was to unlock the door and make a run for it. But when I turned around, I saw that the deadbolt was already unlocked. My hands shook as I tried to twist the lock back into place. That's when I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate footsteps, coming toward me from the back of the store. I spun around, expecting to see someone, but the aisle in front of me was empty. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and then I heard something even worse. Breathing. Slow, steady breathing, coming from somewhere close. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, my mind racing. And then I saw it. Just out of the corner of my eye, a figure darted between the shelves, moving toward me. I bolted for the door, throwing it open and sprinting into the parking lot. I didn't even look back. My car was parked at the far end of the lot, but I wasn't going to risk trying to get to it. Instead, I ran straight for the gas station across the street, where I knew someone would still be working. The clerk at the gas station must have seen the panic on my face because he immediately asked if I was okay. I could barely get the words out as I told him someone was in the store. He called the police, and within minutes, 2 officers arrived and went inside to check it out. They didn't find anyone. The store was empty, and nothing was out of place except for one thing. The back door, which I was sure I had locked earlier, was wide open. They told me it was probably just a homeless person looking for a place to stay, but I wasn't convinced. Whoever it was had been deliberately hiding, and the way they moved it felt like they were playing some kind of game. I quit that job the next day. I told my manager what had happened, and while he apologized profusely, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been in the store that night wasn't just passing through. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear those footsteps in my dreams. And sometimes I wonder if they ever found a new hiding place.